The biggest retirement mistake, it isn't running out of money, it's dying with money that you were too afraid to spend. Let me give you an example. Carol, she had the money. A rule from 1994, the 4% rule, told her exactly how much of it she was allowed to touch every year for the rest of her life. $23,200, not a dollar more. She had already picked the trailhead. She already read the review of every outfitter twice. The backcountry trip into Yellowstone that she'd wanted before she even retired, she let the permit deadline pass. Anyway, she could afford it, but the rule said she couldn't. The number was wrong. This isn't a video about budgeting. It's one of the most repeated retirement myths out there. A single piece of math written 30 years ago that is quietly telling millions of retirees to spend the least money during the years they have the most life left in them. And Carol's not unusual. If you talk to enough retirees, you're going to hear the same story with a different noun. A cruise, a grandchild's wedding, a boat sitting in dry storage for 3 summers running. Different trip, same rule, and same hesitation. This isn't about being reckless with money. It's about a rule so widely repeated that most people never stop to ask, hey, where does that really come from? Or what was it actually built to do in the first place? If you've ever asked, hey, what's the 4% rule? And gotten a straight textbook answer, that's the problem. The textbook answer is correct and still wrong for you. Look, stick with me for the next few minutes, because if you've ever done the math on how much can I safely withdraw, guess what? You've met this rule. And you were never told what it actually assumes about you. Here's the assumption almost everyone misses. The 4% rule, it doesn't come from your life. It comes from testing every 30-year stretch in the historical data, including the worst ones like the Depression. Some planners call it a safe withdrawal rate. Same thing. In 1994, a planner named William Bengen, most people call him Bill Bengen, ran those numbers and found withdraw 4% the first year, adjust that same dollar amount for inflation every year after, and even in the worst case, your money survives. That's not a small thing to solve. Retire right before a bad few years in the market, and withdrawing too much too early can wreck a portfolio permanently, even if the market recovers later on. His math was protecting against exactly that. The worst 30 years we've ever had, so your money could survive the worst 30 years that might be still to come. For Carol, that's $23,200 the first year. Then the same buying power, year after year on autopilot for 3 decades. It's not a bad rule. It solved one problem, not running out. But it was never built to ask a second question. Not running out of what exactly? Here's what nobody put on the label. The 4% rule gives you the exact same spending power at 63 that it gives you at 83, a flat line. But you are not a flat line. Carol, at 63, she can still shoulder a 30-pound pack and hike 8 miles to a backcountry site. David Blanchett is the researcher who first noticed a pattern in retiree spending. He called it the retirement spending smile. Spending starts high, dips in the middle years, and then curves back up later on in life because of healthcare costs. You can picture a U on a graph. But even Blanchett went back and looked closer. Using real household data instead of averages, he found that for typical retiree, spending doesn't curve back up at all. It just keeps gently declining. The smile mostly disappears. He's now calling the real pattern a smirk instead. And it's not just his own terminology that changed. Bill Bengen, the man who invented the 4% rule, he has since raised his own number to 4.7%. So get this, the person who wrote the 4% rule doesn't even use the 4% rule anymore. Either way, the smile, it isn't what the data actually shows. And the number itself keeps moving. The version of this rule most people were handed accounts for none of it. It hands Carol the same $23,200, whether she's setting up a tent at 9,000 feet or sitting in a waiting room. It solved a market problem using the best data available in 1994. It was never built to optimize a life 3 decades later. So think about what actually changes between 63 and 83. At 63, most people are still active, traveling, hiking, chasing grandkids around a backyard. By the mid-80s, for a lot of people, the biggest expense, it isn't a plane ticket, it's a caregiver. The problem isn't that your spending changes, the problem is a rule that assumes it never does. So Carol did what the rule told her. She let the permit deadline pass. She told herself there'd be another season. Each time the math, it technically checks out. She was on track, but nobody ever showed her the other side of that ledger. The trips, they don't come back around. The version of her that could still make the climb and chose not to because a formula from 1994 didn't know her knees still worked. And Carol, she isn't rare. A recent study from the Employee Benefit Research Institute found that roughly a third of retirees still have all or more of their original savings left by their mid-80s. Look, folks, that's not careful planning. That's 30 years of trips, hobbies, and time with the grandkids that a formula talked them out of. Multiply that one hesitation by every year of a 30-year retirement, and you're not looking at a rounding error. You're looking at a life measured out in the wrong unit. This is the part of the belief that needs to break. Running out of money is a real risk. Man, trust me, I feel that same way. But so is running out of health before you spent $1 of the money you saved specifically so you can still enjoy it. The 4% rule only measures one of those risks. It was never designed to measure the other. Now, so here's the shift that many planners now prefer. Instead of the flat 4% line, it's spending in stages. Higher withdrawals in the active go-go years while your health still allows it. A natural pullback in the slower years when spending drops on its own. Most retirees do this without even trying. Then planning separately for that final stretch when healthcare, not travel, is the real number you've got to protect. Look, you might be thinking, hey, what about a bad market right when I retire? Isn't that exactly what the 4% rule was built to survive? It is. And that's still a real risk worth protecting against. The difference, instead of deciding once and never changing, some planners adjust the withdrawal itself as markets and life change. A flexible approach that sometimes planners call dynamic guardrails. Let's go back to Carol. Let's say Carol retires and the market has a strong first 5 years. This kind of approach might let her withdrawal creep up a little bit because the plan can see it's working. Say instead the market drops hard in year 2. The same approach has her pull back for a couple of years. It's not because she failed. It's because that's exactly what the plan is designed to do before returning back to normal once things recover. It's one approach, not a guarantee, but it responds to what actually is happening instead of guessing once in year 1 and then locking in that guess for 3 decades. And for the real risk, what is that? Long-term care. Some planners recommend naming it directly, as one possible strategy. Set aside a specific amount just for that, size to the real risk. Instead of taking a smaller slice out of every single year for 30 years because of a fear that may not even apply to you. Look, this isn't about breaking the 4% rule just to break it. It's about answering the real question. How much can you actually spend in retirement instead of the flatter, safer sounding question that the rule was built to answer instead? The math can handle it. The rule she was handed couldn't. So Carol went into Yellowstone. She got the trip she'd wanted for years while her knees could still carry her there. She watched the sun come up over a ridge line she'd only ever seen in photos. With a pack on her back, she wasn't sure a few months earlier that she'd ever even actually use her portfolio. Is still intact because the number that mattered, it wasn't 4%. It was the actual shape of her life mapped against her actual money. She didn't blow through her savings. She didn't spend recklessly. She just stopped treating every dollar like it might be the one she'd regret spending later. Look, imagine two retirees who die with the exact same amount of money. One spent 30 years afraid to touch it. The other spent 30 years living the life that the money was for in the first place. The portfolio never knew the difference. Only they did. Look, you're not being asked to spend recklessly. You're being asked to stop measuring your healthiest years and the bucket list trip you've been putting off against a formula that was never built to protect them in the first place. The 4% rule, it's not the villain. It solved a real problem, and it solved it really quite well. The rule was never the mistake. The mistake is treating a worst case, one-size-fits-all number as if it were a life sentence, instead of a starting point that you're allowed to adjust as your own life and your own health actually unfolds. None of this works if it just stays a feeling. It has to become a number that you can actually see. Look, if you want to see your own number where it actually falls, not the flat 1994 version, but the real one for you, look, drop your email at brainflash.com. It'll come right to your inbox. If looking at retirement like this is helpful, would you please pass this on to somebody else who is doing the retirement math right now, and they just need to see the real numbers? This is Brain Flash.